I learned I'd been disinherited, not from a letter or a lawyer. I learned it at the family table, when my Aunt Linda, without even looking at me, said, "Well, since everyone's here, I think now's a good time to break the news, you're no longer in the will." At first, I didn't understand the meaning of the words. They just hung in the air, like something unreal. "What?" I blurted out. She smiled. Calmly. Coldly. The way people smile when they're sure they've already won. My Uncle Mark looked down. My cousins exchanged glances. My mother turned pale, and Linda continued, as if she were commenting on the weather, "It'll be best for the family. You've been estranged for a long time anyway. We've decided to redistribute." I felt my ears pop. My heart was pounding somewhere in my throat. Dad would never. I began, but she interrupted abruptly, "Your father trusted me. And the documents are already signed." Documents. The word hit harder than a slap. I looked around at the faces, and didn't see a single one on my side. No one said, "Wait." No one asked, "Is it true?" Everyone simply accepted it. In that moment, I realized two things. First, I'd been written off. Second, they were sure I'd keep quiet. And it was at that moment that something clicked inside me. To understand why being cut out hurt the way it did, you need to know my family dynamic. On the outside, we looked like a tight, respectable American family. Sunday dinners, holiday photos, forced smiles. But underneath, everything revolved around control, money, and appearances. The inheritance came from my grandfather, Richard. He built everything from nothing, a small construction business that turned into several properties, investments, and a house that had been in the family for decades. Growing up, I was the one who spent time with him. I drove him to doctor appointments, helped organize paperwork, listened to the same stories over and over without rushing him. Everyone else treated him like an obligation. My Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark, though, always acted like the inheritance already belonged to them. They talked openly about what would happen someday, which rooms they'd renovate, which assets they'd sell. My mother stayed quiet but always sided with whoever had the loudest voice in the room. I wasn't perfect, but I was responsible. I stayed out of trouble, worked steadily, and never asked for handouts. That actually made me invisible. In my family, being calm meant being overlooked. Being loud meant being powerful, so when my grandfather passed, I assumed, naively, that things would be handled fairly. I believed love and effort mattered more than manipulation. That belief didn't survive long. For as long as I can remember, everyone assumed I would be included in the will. Not because I demanded it, not because I felt entitled, but because I was there. When my grandfather's health started declining, I was the one driving him to appointments, sitting in hospital waiting rooms, managing his medications when he forgot what he'd already taken. I handled paperwork he didn't understand anymore. I listened when he talked about his regrets, his fears, his pride in what he'd built. He used to say things like, "You're the only one who really checks on me," or "When I'm gone, make sure the family doesn't tear itself apart." Those words stuck with me. Not because of money, but because they felt like trust. There was never a formal conversation where he laid out numbers or assets, but there were hints. He talked about the house staying with someone responsible. He mentioned that he'd updated documents after my grandmother passed. My aunt even joked once, "Well, you've earned your spot." Everyone laughed. No one disagreed. That's why the shock hit so hard. This wasn't some distant relative leaving me out of spite. This was a man who relied on me daily, who told me I mattered, who made it sound like I had a role in protecting what he'd built. I wasn't expecting everything. I wasn't even expecting much. I was expecting fairness. So when they acted like my exclusion was obvious, like I was crazy for being surprised, something didn't add up. And deep down, a quiet, unsettling thought started forming, this wasn't an accident. I didn't find out I was cut out of the inheritance in some dramatic courtroom scene. It was worse than that, casual, careless, like my absence didn't even matter. It happened at a family dinner I almost didn't attend. My Uncle Mark was talking too loudly after a couple of glasses of wine, bragging about how everything was finally settled and how Mom would have been proud of how we handled it. Then my cousin Lisa laughed and said, "Yeah, especially with Emily out of the picture. That made things so much easier." Out of the picture. I froze. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I asked, very calmly, what she meant. The table went silent in that uncomfortable, heavy way that tells you everything you need to know before anyone even speaks. I didn't find out I was cut out of the inheritance in some dramatic courtroom scene. It was worse than that, casual, careless, like my absence didn't even matter. It happened at a family dinner I almost didn't attend. My Uncle Mark was talking too loudly after a couple of glasses of wine, bragging about how everything was finally settled and how Mom would have been proud of how we handled it. Then my cousin Lisa laughed and said, "Yeah, especially with Emily out of the picture. That made things so much easier." Out of the picture. I froze. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I asked, very calmly, what she meant. The table went silent in that uncomfortable, heavy way that tells you everything you need to know before anyone even speaks. What hurt more than being cut out of the inheritance was how they acted afterward. There was a family dinner a week after the will reading. I wasn't even sure why I went, but a small, stupid part of me hoped there had been a mistake. Instead, I walked into a room that felt like a celebration I wasn't invited to. Bottles of wine were already open. My uncle was joking about finally being able to renovate the lake house. My cousin Sarah was scrolling through furniture listings on her phone like it was a hobby. No one acknowledged me at first. When I finally sat down, my aunt glanced at me and said, casually, "Oh, you came. Not hi. Not how are you holding up." Just that. Like I was an inconvenience that hadn't gotten the hint. Then the comments started. Quiet at first. Side glances. Little laughs when money came up. Someone actually raised a glass and said, "To family who earned their place." I felt my face burn, but no one defended me. Not one person. When I tried to speak up, to ask why no one had told me this was coming, my cousin rolled her eyes and said, "Don't make this about you. Grandpa made his choice." Another added, "You always were too sensitive." That was the moment I understood something clearly for the first time. They weren't just okay with cutting me out. They enjoyed watching me realize I didn't belong. I left early. No one followed. No one texted to check if I got home safely. The silence afterward was louder than anything they'd said at that table. That night, alone in my apartment, I cried harder than I had since the funeral. But underneath the humiliation and shock, something else was forming, quiet, cold, and steady. They thought this was the end of my story. They had no idea it was just the beginning. That's when the excuses started. One by one, carefully rehearsed, delivered with fake sympathy and righteous tones. Aunt Linda said I was too independent and therefore didn't need anything. My cousin Mark shrugged and told me Grandpa always worried I'd waste the money. Someone else actually said, "You live in another state, it wouldn't be fair to the rest of us." What hurt most wasn't just the lies, it was how confidently they told them. Like they'd all agreed on a script. Like this version of me, selfish and irresponsible, had always existed in their minds. When I reminded them I'd been the one helping Grandpa with his bills, driving him to appointments, managing paperwork when no one else bothered, they smiled and said I was overreacting or rewriting history. My uncle even laughed and said, "Come on, it's not like you were promised anything." That one felt like a slap. Because he knew that wasn't true. We all did. Grandpa had talked openly about making things fair. About remembering who showed up. They framed it as logic. As practicality. As what Grandpa would have wanted. But every justification contradicted something else they'd said before. The more they talked, the more cracks appeared. Stories didn't line up. Dates changed. Reasons shifted depending on who was asking. And then came the worst line of all, "This isn't personal." It was the most personal thing they could have done. That was the moment I stopped fighting them out loud. No more arguing at family dinners. No more emotional texts trying to explain myself. No more begging to be seen as anything other than the family disappointment they'd decided I was. On the outside, I went quiet. Calm. Agreeable, even. But inside, something shifted. I started listening instead of reacting. I noticed how my Uncle Mark slipped up and mentioned a meeting I was never supposed to know about. I noticed how my cousin Jessica couldn't keep her story straight about when the will was supposedly changed. I noticed how my Aunt Linda suddenly avoided eye contact whenever finances came up, like she was afraid I might ask the wrong question. They thought my silence meant defeat. That I'd finally accepted my place. What they didn't realize was that silence gave me clarity. I started replaying old conversations in my head. Little comments that hadn't made sense at the time. Jokes about handling things before she gets ideas. Side glances when my name came up. The way decisions were suddenly made without me, then presented as a done deal. I also started watching how nervous they got when I stopped reacting. When I didn't cry. When I didn't explode. When I just nodded and said, okay. People who are lying hate calm, and the calmer I became, the more cracks I saw forming in their story. What finally made everything click wasn't something they said to my face, it was a letter they didn't think I'd understand. A certified envelope arrived at my old address by mistake, and the new tenant forwarded it to me. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, addressed to my Uncle David as executor. I almost threw it away. Almost. Inside was a notice about a pending audit tied to my grandfather's estate. Not routine. Not small. There were references to asset transfers, tax discrepancies, and something called potential misrepresentation. My hands were shaking as I read it again and again. I started digging quietly. Public records. Property filings. Old emails I'd archived and never deleted. That's when I saw it. Several assets had been moved before my grandfather passed, but listed as if they'd been transferred after. Dates didn't line up. Signatures looked off. Suddenly, the way they rushed the will, the way they froze me out, the way they kept saying, "It's already handled, don't worry about it," it all made sense. They hadn't just cut me out. They were hiding something. And worse? If this blew up publicly, it wouldn't just be their reputations on the line. It would be the entire family name. That's when the weight of it really hit me. I could walk away. I had every reason to. They'd already erased me from the will, rewritten history, and made it clear I was disposable. Any normal person would have cut their losses and let the whole thing burn. And part of me wanted to. God, I wanted to. I imagined blocking every number, changing my last name, and never looking back. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that if I stayed silent, this wouldn't just hurt them quietly, it would explode publicly. There were mistakes in the estate filings. Sloppy ones. Tax issues, assets that had been moved in ways that didn't match the paperwork. If the wrong person noticed, a bank, an auditor, the court, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be devastating. Lawsuits. Investigations. Headlines my family would never recover from. And the worst part? They had no idea. They were so busy congratulating themselves for cutting me out that they didn't see the cliff they were standing on. I remember sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the documents spread across my table, realizing I held something far more powerful than anger. I held the truth, and a choice. I could protect myself and let them fall. Or I could step in, fix the mess, and save the very people who had just pushed me out like I meant nothing. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I didn't know what I could do, but because I had to decide who I wanted to be after all of this was over. That was the night I couldn't sleep at all. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, rereading the emails and documents I had uncovered. I kept asking myself the same question over and over, why should I care? They had already cut me out. They'd humiliated me, dismissed me, erased me like I never mattered. Walking away would have been easy. I could have let everything collapse and told myself it wasn't my problem anymore. but the truth was harder. What I'd discovered wasn't just about money. It was about fraud, about lies that could explode publicly and drag everyone's names through the mud, including my late father's. If this came out the wrong way, it wouldn't just hurt them. It would stain the memory of the one person who had actually loved me. That realization made my chest ache in a different way. Not anger, responsibility. I hated that it fell on me. I hated that the same family who discarded me would be saved by my silence or my action. And I knew, painfully clearly, that if I did nothing, I'd regret it for the rest of my life, not for them, but for myself. So I made a decision that night. I would act, quietly, carefully, and without asking for permission or credit. Not to get my inheritance back. Not to prove them wrong. But to prevent a disaster they were too arrogant to see coming. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't announce anything. I simply opened my laptop, took a deep breath, and started preparing for the next step, knowing full well that once I moved forward, there would be no turning back. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand an apology. I moved quietly, the way people do when they finally understand that noise only helps their enemies. I started by calling a lawyer, not their lawyer, not the family friend who always handled things, but an independent estate attorney in the next city. I laid everything out, the will, the transfers, the missing filings, the shortcuts I had noticed. There was a long pause on the line. Then he said, very calmly, "If this goes public, your family has a serious problem." That was the moment my stomach dropped, not out of fear, but clarity. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered documents. Old emails. Bank statements no one thought I'd kept. A signed letter that contradicted the final version of the will. I didn't confront anyone. I just watched. I listened. I let them keep celebrating, keep pretending I was irrelevant. Then, through my lawyer, I sent a single formal notice. No accusations. No drama. Just facts, and a warning that if the situation wasn't addressed correctly, regulators, courts, and the press could become involved. The silence afterward was immediate and deafening. For the first time since I'd been cut out, I wasn't reacting. I was intervening. It happened faster than I expected. The calm confidence my relatives had worn for weeks cracked the moment they realized I wasn't bluffing. Phone calls started coming in late at night. Voices that had dismissed me as irrelevant suddenly sounded strained, polite, almost scared. My Uncle Mark stopped joking. My cousin stopped posting smug family photos online. Even my aunt, the loudest voice insisting I deserved nothing, suddenly wanted to clear the air. I could hear it in the pauses. In the way they asked careful questions instead of making accusations. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't yet know how bad it was. Then the panic hit. A lawyer contacted them. A bank froze part of an account. A document they assumed no one would ever question was suddenly being reviewed. And that's when the masks really slipped. The same people who told me to move on started blaming each other. It was her idea. I just signed what they gave me. We didn't think it would matter. They stopped pretending it was about principle. It was about fear. Fear of audits. Fear of exposure. Fear that their quiet little arrangement would turn into a public mess. And for the first time, I wasn't the problem they could silence. I was the risk they couldn't control. I didn't yell. I didn't confront them. I just listened, and finally saw who they really were when power slipped out of their hands. It was subtle at first, the change in tone. The same relatives who had ignored my calls, who told me I was overreacting and entitled, suddenly started speaking carefully. Slowly. Respectfully. My Uncle Mark stopped interrupting me. My cousin Rachel asked questions instead of making accusations. And my Aunt Linda, the loudest voice against me, went completely quiet. That's when it hit me, they finally understood. I wasn't begging anymore. I wasn't asking to be included. I wasn't fighting for approval. I was the only one standing between them and complete disaster. The legal issue I uncovered wasn't small. If it went public, it wouldn't just cost money, it would destroy reputations, careers, and everything my family had spent decades protecting. And now they knew I had the documents, the timeline, and the legal leverage. For the first time, I watched them feel powerless. They started saying things like, "We're still family," and "We may have made mistakes," and my personal favorite, "We never meant to hurt you." The same people who cut me out without hesitation were suddenly terrified of losing everything. And the most ironic part? They didn't need forgiveness. They needed me. That was the moment the balance shifted, quietly, unmistakably, permanently. By the time everything came out, the family avoided total destruction, but not without scars. The penalties were reduced, the lawsuits settled quietly, and the scandal never reached the press. On paper, it looked like a close call. Inside the family, it felt like an earthquake. My uncle lost his position at the company anyway. Not because of the authorities, but because no one trusted him anymore. My cousin's business partners pulled out one by one after learning how close they came to being dragged into fraud. Family dinners stopped. Group chats went silent. Everyone suddenly became very polite with me in a way that felt almost painful. No one apologized. Not really. Instead, there were phrases like, "We all made mistakes," or "It was a stressful time." My name was rarely mentioned directly, but I could feel it hovering in every room, the uncomfortable truth that the person they tried to erase was the one who saved them from public disgrace. I wasn't invited back into the family circle. I wasn't offered my inheritance. But I wasn't invisible anymore either. They knew now that excluding me had been a choice, and that choice had almost cost them everything. And that knowledge? It changed the way they looked at me forever. Looking back now, the strangest part isn't that my family cut me out of the inheritance, it's that losing it forced me to finally see myself clearly. For years, I tied my worth to their approval, to being included, to being treated fairly by people who had already decided I was expendable. When they chose greed over integrity, I could have walked away bitter and broken. Instead, I chose to act with principles they never expected from me. I didn't save them to win love. I didn't step in to be thanked. I did it because I could live with myself afterward, and that mattered more than money, property, or apologies that came too late and sounded hollow anyway. What I learned is this: inheritance can reveal the worst in people, but it can also reveal who you are when it counts. If your family betrays you over money, documents, or promises, remember this: being excluded doesn't make you less valuable. Sometimes it means you were the only one with values strong enough to stand alone. My advice? Protect your integrity before you protect relationships that don't protect you back. Money comes and goes. Character stays. And in the end, that's the only thing they couldn't take from me.